Book 2, Chapter 1, Part 6 of History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1, by Henry Charles LEA. Book 2, Chapter 1. Relations with the Crown. Part 6. Though, as we have seen, the independence of the Inquisition as a self-centered and self-sustaining institution in the state varied with the temper and the necessities of the sovereign, there was a time for when it seemed as though it might throw off all subjection and become dominant. But for the prudence of Ferdinand in insisting upon the power of appointment and dismissal, this might have happened in the temper of the Spanish people, trained to an exaltation of detestation of heresy which to us may well appear incomprehensible. There is no question that, under the canon law, kings, like their subjects, were amenable to the jurisdiction of the Inquisition, and that they held their kingdoms on the tenure not only of their own orthodoxy, but of purging their lands of heresy and heretics. The principles which had been worked so effectually for the destruction of the houses of Toulouse and of Hohenstaufen, and under which Pius V released the subjects of Queen Elizabeth from their allegiance in 1570, were fully recognized in Spain as vital to the faith. But beyond this, the Spaniards, in their exuberance of their religious ardor, boasted that their national institutions conditioned orthodoxy as necessary to their kingship. Even when the 17th century was well advanced, a learned and loyal jurisconsult tells us that, from the time of the Sixth Council of Toledo in 638, their monarchs had imposed on themselves the law that, if they fell into heresy, they were to be excommunicated and exterminated; that Ferdinand in 1492 had renewed this law, and that he had instituted that most severe tribunal, the Inquisition, and had sanctioned that, in view of the Toledan canon, all kings in future should be subject to it. Even Spanish loyalty could not have been relied upon to sustain a king suspect of heresy, against the claims of the Holy Office to try him in secret, and suspicion of heresy was a very elastic term. Impeding the Inquisition came within its definition, and any effort to curb the arrogant extension of its powers could readily be so construed, as Macanaz found to his sorrow. The fact that the Inquisition possessed such power must have had its influence more than once on the mind of the sovereign when engaged in debate with his too powerful subject, and perhaps explains what appears to us occasionally a pusillanimous yielding. The monarchs had guarded the Inquisition against all supervision and all accountability to the other departments of the government. Within its own sphere it was supreme and irresponsible, and its sphere, owing to the exemption from the secular courts accorded to all connected with it in however remote a degree, covered a large area of civil and criminal businesses, besides its proper function of preserving the purity of the faith. In this self-centered independence it stood alone. Even the spiritual jurisdiction of the Church, so jealously guarded, had become subject to the recurso de fuerza, which, like the French appeal as from an abuse, gave to those who suffered wrong an appeal to the Council of Castile. But even from this the Inquisition was exempt. A decree of Prince Philip in 1553 was its aegis and was constantly invoked. This was addressed to all the courts and judicial officers of the land and affirmed, in the most positive terms, the sole and exclusive jurisdiction of the Inquisition in all matters within its competence, civil or criminal, concerning the faith or confiscations. And faith was a convenient term covering the impeding of the Inquisition in all that it wanted to do. Philip recited that repeated cedulas of Ferdinand and Isabella and of Charles V had asserted this, and now he reaffirmed and enforced it. No appeals from its tribunals were to be entertained, for the only appeal lay to the Suprema, which would redress any wrong, for it, by delegation from the crown and the Holy See, had exclusive cognizance of such matters. If therefore anything concerning the Inquisition should be brought before them, they must decline to entertain it and must refer it back to the Holy Office. The Inquisition was not content to enjoy these favors as a revocable grace from the crown but, in a consulta of December 22, 1634, it advanced the claim that this decree was a bargain or compact between two powers which could not be in any way modified without mutual consent. This was emphasized in a printed argument in 1642, asserting that the transaction could only become of binding force by the consent of both parties, the king and the Inquisitor-General, and the king had no power to change it of his own motion, as it was an agreement. Even where it admitted to be a concession granted by the crown, this would make no difference, for a privilege conceding to one who is not a subject, as the Inquisition in the present case, and accepted by the latter becomes a contract which the prince cannot revoke. We shall see hereafter the use made of this by the Inquisition in its daily quarrels with all the other jurisdictions, but a single case may be cited here to indicate how it utilized this position to render itself virtually independent. There was a long-standing debate over canonries in the churches of Antequera, Malaga and the Canaries, which it claimed to be suppressed for its benefit under the brief of January 7, 1559, but which the royal Camara asserted to belong to the patronage of the king, whose rights of appointment were not curtailed by the brief. A suit on the subject, commenced in 1562, was not yet decided when, about 1611, the king filled vacancies in Malaga and the Canaries. This provoked a discussion, during which, without awaiting settlement, the inquisitors excommunicated the appointees, and an inquisitorial excommunication could be removed only by him who had fulminated it, by the Inquisitor-General, or by the Pope. In 1611 the king ordered the appointees to be absolved, and mandates signed by him to that effect were addressed to the inquisitors of Malaga and the Canaries. The Suprema complained loudly of this, as an unheard-of violation of the rights of the Holy Office, and refused obedience. In 1612 it declared that, when the appointees abandoned the prebends which they had usurped, they should be absolved, and not before. On February 12th, in a consulta to the king, it argued that its power had always been so great and so independent of all other bodies in the state, that the kings had never allowed them to interfere with it, directly or indirectly. It determined for itself everything relating to itself, consulting only with the king and permitting no interference of any kind. Its determination prevailed over the weakness of the king, who ordered the Camara to desist from its pretensions and not to despoil the Holy Office. These somewhat audacious assertions of independence were chiefly stimulated by the perpetual quarrels arising from the exclusive jurisdiction, civil and criminal, exercised by the Inquisition over its thousands of employees and familiars and their families, which kept the land in confusion. This is a subject which will require detailed consideration hereafter, and is only referred to here because of its development into the exaggerated pretensions of the Inquisition to emancipate itself from all control. When Ferdinand granted this fuero, it was understood on all hands to be a special deputation of the royal jurisdiction and as such liable at any time to modification or revocation. Ferdinand himself, in a cedula of August 18, 1501, alluded to it as such. The inquisitors enjoyed it just as the corregidors did. So, in the Concordia of Castile in 1553, defining the extent of this jurisdiction, the inquisitors are specially described as holding it from the king, and Philip II, Philip III, and Philip IV repeatedly alluded to it as held during the royal pleasure. There was no thought of disputing this until the 17th century was well advanced. The Suprema itself, in papers of 1609, 1619, 1637, and 1639, freely admitted that its temporal jurisdiction was a grant from the king, while its spiritual was a grant from the pope. Apparently, the earliest departure from this universally conceded position was made, in 1623, by Portocarrero in an argument on a clash of jurisdictions in Majorca, wherein he sought to prove that the civil and criminal jurisdiction of the Inquisition over the subordinates was ecclesiastical and derived from the pope. About the same time, in an official paper, a similar claim was advanced, based on the papal briefs authorizing Torquemada and his successors to appoint, dismiss, and punish their subordinates. These were mere speculations and attracted no attention at the time. We have just seen that as late as 1639 the Suprema made no claims of the kind, but 2 years later, in 1641, it suddenly adopted them in the most offensive fashion. There was a competencia, or conflict of jurisdiction, between the Tribunal of Valladolid and the Chancelleria, or High Royal Court. The Council of Castile had occasion to present several consultas to the king, in one of which it said that the jurisdiction exercised in the name of the king by the Inquisition was temporal, secular, and precarious, and could not be defended by excommunication. Thereupon, the Suprema assembled its theologians, who pronounced these propositions to be false, rash, and akin to heretical error. Armed with this opinion, the fiscal or prosecuting officer accused the whole Council of Castile, demanding that its consulta be suppressed and that its authors be prosecuted. Theoretically, there was nothing to prevent such action, which would have rendered the Inquisition the dominating power in the land, but the Suprema lacked hardihood. Even the habitual subservience of Philip IV was revolted, and he told the Inquisitor-General that he had done ill to lend himself to a question contrary to the sovereignty of the monarch and to the honor of the highest council in the nation. In spite of this rebuff, having once asserted the claim that its temporal jurisdiction was spiritual and not secular, the Inquisition adhered to it. The prize was worth a struggle, for it would have put the whole nation at its mercy. It would have deprived the king of powers to check aggression and to protect his subjects from oppression for, as Portocarrero had pointed out, although princes have authority to relieve their subjects when aggrieved by other secular subjects, they have none when the oppressors are ecclesiastics, exempt by divine law from their jurisdiction. To win this, the Inquisition persisted in its claim. In 1642, on the occasion of a competencia in Granada, there appeared, under its authority, a printed argument to prove that the temporal jurisdiction of the Holy Office was a grant from the Holy See, which had power to intervene in the internal affairs of states, and that it had merely been acquiesced in and confirmed by the kings. Again, in a notorious case occurring in Cuenca in 1645, the inquisitors argued that their temporal jurisdiction was ecclesiastical and papal, with which the king could not interfere. But the audacity with which these pretensions were pushed culminated in a consulta presented by the Suprema, March 31, 1646, to Philip IV, when he was struggling against the determination of the Cortes of Aragon to curb the excesses of the Inquisition. In this paper the Suprema asserted that the civil and political jurisdiction is inferior to the spiritual and ecclesiastical, which can assume any indirect power whatever is necessary for its conservation and unimpeded exercise, without being restricted by secular princes. The royal prerogative is derived from positive human law, or the law of nations. The supreme power of the Inquisition is delegated by the Holy See for cases of faith, with all that is requisite, directly or indirectly, for its untrammeled enjoyment. This is of divine law and, as such, is superior to all human law, to which it is in no way subject. The very least that can be said is that princes are bound to admit this, and though they have a right to concede no more than is requisite, the decision as to what is requisite rests with the ecclesiastical authority, which is based on divine law. Any departure from these principles, under the novel pretext that the king is master of this jurisdiction, with power to limit or abrogate, is dangerous for the conscience and very perilous as leading to the gravest errors. It would be difficult to enunciate more boldly the theory of theocracy, with the Inquisition as its delegate and the crown merely the executor of its decrees. The pretensions were not realized and the king was not reduced to insignificance, but his power was seriously trammeled by the bureaucracy of which the Suprema was the foremost and most aggressive representative. Its quasi-independence led to emulation by the other great departments of the state, and, though their success was not so marked, it was sufficient in all to render the government incredibly cumbersome and inefficient, and to paralyze its action by wasting its strength in efforts to keep the peace between the rival and warring bodies. In these bickerings and dissensions, the power of the crown decreased, and the theoretically autocratic monarch found himself unable to enforce his commands. Philip IV recognized this fatal weakness, but his efforts to overcome the evil were puerile and inefficient. October 15, 1633, he sent to the Suprema, and presumably to the other councils, a decree setting forth emphatically that the slackness of obedience and disregard to the royal commands had been the cause of irreparable damage to the state and must be checked if the monarchy were to be preserved from ruin. It was his duty under God to prevent this. He had unavailingly represented it repeatedly to his councillors, and now he proposed to make out a schedule of penalties to be incurred through disobedience, scaled accordingly to the gravity of each offense. This was to be completed within 30 days, and he called upon the Suprema to give him the necessary information that should enable him to tabulate the matters coming within its sphere of action. This grotesque measure, calling upon offenders to define their offenses for the purpose of providing condign punishment, was received by the Suprema with a cool indifference, showing how lightly it regarded the royal indignation. There was nothing, it said in reply, within its jurisdiction which imperiled the monarchy, for its function was to preserve the monarchy by preserving the unity of religion. As for obedience, it was of the highest importance that the royal commands should be obeyed, and the laws provided punishments for all disobedient vassals. But the canon and imperial laws, and those of Spain, deprived of their places judges who executed royal cedulas issued against justice and the rights of parties, for it was assumed that such could not be the royal intention and that they were decreed in ignorance, so that they were suspended until the prince, better informed, should provide justice. Therefore, when councillors opposed cedulas, which would work great injury to the jurisdiction and immunities of the Holy Office, it was only to prevent innovation, and it was to the discharge of duty that this was represented to the king. The Suprema therefore prayed him that, before determining matters proposed by other councils, they should be submitted to it as heretofore so that, after hearing the reasons of both sides, he might determine according to his pleasure. Thus, with scarcely veiled contempt, the Suprema told him that it would continue to do so as it had done, and the very next year, as we have seen, it boldly informed him that none of his commands respecting the Inquisition would be obeyed until it should have confirmed them, commands, be it remembered, that in no case affected its action in matters of faith, for all the trouble arose from its encroachments on secular affairs. The character of Philip IV ripened and strengthened under adversity and, in the exigencies of the struggle with Catalonia and Portugal, he developed some traits worthy of a sovereign. Although he meekly endured the insolence of the Suprema in 1646 and labored strenuously with the Cortes of Aragon to prevent the reform of abuses, he yet, as we have seen, insisted on the right to supervise appointments. He doubtless asserted his authority in other ways, for the Suprema abated its pretensions that its civil and criminal jurisdiction was spiritual and papal. In an elaborate consulta of March 12, 1668, during a long and dreary contest in which the Tribunal of Majorca was involved, it repeatedly refers to its enjoying the royal jurisdiction from the king, showing that it had abandoned the attempt to render itself independent of the royal authority. Under the imbecile Carlos II and his incapable ministers, the domineering arrogance of the Inquisition increased and, as we shall see hereafter, it successfully eluded a concerted movement, in 1696, of all the other councils, represented in the Junta Magna, to reduce its exuberance. With the advent of the House of Bourbon, however, it was forced to recognize its subordination to the royal will in temporal matters, in spite of the temporary interference of Elizabeth Farnese in favor of Inquisitor-General Giudice. We have already seen indications of this and shall see more. Meanwhile, a single instance will suffice to show how imperiously Philip V, under the guidance of Macanaz, could impose his commands. In 1712 there was an echo of the old quarrel over the so-called suppressed canonries of Antequera, Malaga and the Canaries. The suit, commenced in 1562, had never been decided and had long been suspended. The trouble of 1612 had been quieted by allowing the Inquisition to enjoy the canonries, not as a right, but as a revocable grant from the crown. Excesses committed by the inquisitors in collecting the fruits led to the resumption of the benefices and then, by a transaction in 1622, they were restored under the same conditions. Such was the position when a violent quarrel arose in the Canaries between the tribunal and the chapter. The former questioned the accuracy of the accounts rendered to it by demanding the account books. This the chapter refused, but offered to place the books in the accounting room of the cathedral, allowing the officials of the tribunal free access and permission to make what copies they desired. There was also a subsidiary quarrel over the claim that, when the secretary of the tribunal went to the chapter, he should be entitled to precedence. With their customary violence, the inquisitors publicly excommunicated and fined the dean and treasurer of the chapter, and moreover they took under their protection the Dominican Joseph Guillen, prior of San Pedro Martir, who was a notary of the tribunal. He circulated a defamatory libel on the chapter, which laid a complaint before his superior, the provincial. The latter commenced to investigate, when the tribunal inhibited him from all cognizance of the matter. Then there came a mandate from the Dominican general to the provincial, relegating Fray Guillen to a convent and ordering a president to be appointed to San Pedro Martir, whereupon the tribunal required the provincial to surrender this mandate and all papers concerning the affair, under pain of excommunication and 200 ducats. The sub-prior of San Pedro Martir, was forced to assemble the brethren, whom the inquisitors ordered to disobey the commands of the general and not to acknowledge the president appointed under his instructions, thus violating the statutes of the great Dominican order and the principle of obedience on which it is based. They further excommunicated the provincial in the most solemn manner. They took by force Fray Guillen from the convent and paraded the streets in his company. The whole community was thrown into confusion, and to prevent recourse to the home authorities they forbade, under heavy penalties, the departure of any vessel for Teneriffe, through which communication was had through Spain. In all this there was nothing at variance with the customary methods of asserting the lawless supremacy of the Inquisition over the secular and spiritual authorities. But Philip V ordered Giudice, September 30th, 1712, to put an end to these excesses and, on October 11th, the Suprema reported that it had ordered the inquisitors to desist. If it did so, they paid no attention to its commands. Then, in June 11th, 1713, he addressed a peremptory order to Giudice to revoke all that had been done in the Canaries, to recall the inquisitors, to dismiss them and give them no other appointments. The Suprema replied, July 18th, enclosing an order which it proposed dispatching. This displeased him as not in compliance with his commands, and he insisted on their complete fulfillment. Still there was evasion and delay, and when, in July 1714, the Canary chapter presented to the tribunal royal orders requiring the removal of the excommunicants and the remission of the fines, the inquisitors not only refused obedience, but commenced proceedings against the notaries who served them. The Suprema professed to have sent orders similar to those of the king, but it evidently had been playing a double game. Philip, therefore, November 1st, 1714, addressed the Inquisitor-General, holding the Suprema responsible for the prolonged contumacy of the inquisitors. He ordered it to deliver to him the originals of all the correspondence on the subject, and required the Inquisitor-General to issue an order for the immediate departure from the islands of the inquisitors and fiscal, without forcing the governor to expel them, as he had orders to do so in case of disobedience. Moreover, if the Suprema should not, within 15 days, deliver all the documents, so that the king could regulate matters directly with the tribunal, the old suspended suit would be reopened and such action would be taken as might be found requisite. This was a tone wholly different from that to which the Inquisition had been accustomed under the Habsburgs. The evasions and delays of the Suprema, which had so long been successful, proved fruitless. The struggle was prolonged, but the royal authority prevailed in the end, although, when the inquisitors reached Spain, in the summer of 1715, Giudice had been restored to office, and Philip weakly permitted them to be provided for in other tribunals and to curse fresh communities with their lawless audacity. We shall hereafter have occasion to see how, under the House of Bourbon, with its Gallican ideas as to royal prerogative, the subordination of the Inquisition became recognized, while its jurisdiction was curtailed and its influence was diminished. End of Book 2, Chapter 1, Part 6.